Fully Ramblomatic Volume 2 Blu-ray containing every 2025 episode is now available in our store, and the Volume 1 Blu-ray's back in stock as well. On sale now.
Let's all laugh at an industry that never learns anything TEE.
In the very first one of these I did back in the yellow background beady eyes shitty management era, I talked about E.T. and how Atari 2600's glut of low-quality third-party games led the way for the Western games industry in the 80s like an incontinent Scottish deerhound leashed to the nose cone of a paper aeroplane. But today I would like to tell you the sequel to that sorry story, which features a new hero, an awakening of power, the twist return of a villain previously thought dead, a redemption arc, and in short everything a good sequel needs besides a Bruce Campbell cameo. I said in the first installment that the collapse of Atari is what paved the way for Nintendo to take over the West, dominate the global games industry, and make an entire generation of American youth fixated on trying to look up Princess Peach's skirt in Smash Brothers, but Nintendo were mindful of not letting history run in cycles. How, when they brought their Nintendo Entertainment System to America, could they avoid Atari's mistake of letting shitty third-party developers flood the market with cheap rushed-out underpantage? Their solution was what one might call a very early form of video game DRM, in the way that giving a piggyback ride to a man holding an inflatable globe was a very early form of GPS navigation. Every NES console had what was called a CIC chip, or Checking Integrated Circuit. A corresponding chip was put in the cartridge of all Nintendo's approved games. If the one chip couldn't detect the other chip and exchange a passcode, the console would enter a continuous reset cycle. Simple, really. Compared to modern digital security, it's basically one step up from hiring a chimp holding a finger on the end of a stick and having it constantly press the reset button until the user can show it ID or a tasty banana. But it seemed to do the job. Only games with the chips would actually work, and Nintendo could ensure that only the games they approved of had the chips. But some argued that Nintendo had overcorrected in their attempts to bypass the potholes of Atari's mistakes and driven straight into the hedgerow of autocracy. As well as charging licensing fees, Nintendo demanded exclusivity, that developers only make 5 games a year and remove all violent and family-unfriendly content. Not that the world wept for the lack of an NES port of Custer's Revenge, but it was still suppressing creativity. And I hate being put in a position where I have to argue that Mario should be allowed to punitively spank disobedient Yoshis. It makes everyone think I'm a weirdo. So publishers were immediately looking for ways to CI circumnavigate the CIC chip. The publisher Color Dreams took to adding tech to their cartridges that reportedly deactivated the chip with a voltage spike, the equivalent of stunning the chimpanzee with a taser gun. But to my mind, the sort of person who'll fucking electrocute the bouncer to get into a nightclub is not the sort of person I'd want to be sharing a dance floor with in the first place, and Color Dreams' games were all notoriously shitty. Their only noteworthy title being Bible Adventures, which certainly wasn't noteworthy for being a hot ticket among the youth of the day. Unite Club equally doesn't want someone standing in the middle of the dance floor quoting Bible verses and making the atmosphere weird. Nintendo quickly started manufacturing consoles with defenses against voltage spikes. Color Dreams attempted to distribute information on how to disable them manually, but apparently not enough people wanted to go at their expensive electronics with screwdriver and pliers for the sake of fucking Bible Adventures, which to my mind reflects a shocking lack of commitment to Jesus. But I promise this story featured a surprise twist villain resurrection in the form of none other than Atari. Having been saved from annihilation by a partial merger with Namco, Atari Games beheld Nintendo's success with envious eyes. So those Nintendotes think the world is safe from third-party slop, do they? Soon those fools will quake in fear again at the irrepressible shittiness of Atari. And they immediately set out to back-engineer the CIC chip to create their own version of it, until a few moments later when they said, "Oh, I've just remembered we suck at this. Is there a way to get the CIC code that's easier and preferably a little bit more evil?" And what do you know? There was. See, Nintendo copyrighted the CIC, but it turns out you can't copyright a thing without telling someone what it is, and the US Copyright Office had a record of the unlock code. So Atari, cunningly, put on a false moustache, went to the Copyright Office and said, hello, Nintendo was suing me for copyright infringement, sotto voce, or at least they soon will be, and I need to see their CIC code to argue our case in court. And would you believe that actually fucking worked? The Copyright Office cheerfully handed it over, and Atari began releasing unauthorized NES games under the 10-gen label in stylish bad boy black cartridges, fitted with bootleg CIC chips that they had named the Rabbit chip, presumably because it was a right little fucker. At the same time, probably with an attitude of, well, we're in the diarrhea now, might as well start drinking, Atari filed suit against Nintendo for unfair competition, whereupon Nintendo blinked in confusion a couple of times and then sued Atari straight back for unfair competition and patent infringement, whereupon Atari counter-sued Nintendo for unfair competition, patent misuse, and being a bunch of big fat meanie heads. At the trial, the judges fairly and reasonably nodded along as they listened to both sides' arguments, then coughed and said, "Sorry, could you go back to the part where you deliberately committed fraud against the Copyright Office?" Yes, you might have already guessed from how we're very emphatically not currently playing the Atari Switch 2 that Atari didn't do terribly well out of this. Turns out if you break into someone's house and steal their car, you don't then get to complain about how aggressively they locked the garage door. So ever since the dawn, gaming history has been one long futile struggle to find the happy middle ground between overly liberal third-party slop admittance and overbearing soul-crushing exclusivity. But there's a coda to this story. See, Nintendo might have won the trial, but they hardly emerged unbattered. The courts concluded that had Atari back-engineered the chip properly, it would have counted as fair use. They just poisoned the well with that whole crime business, and Nintendo's vulnerabilities were exposed. More lawsuits against Nintendo's business practices followed, along with a full-on investigation by the Fair Trade Commission that led to Nintendo having to pay through the Nintendos. Under pressure from the legal system and unhappy partners, Nintendo were ultimately forced to relax some of their stringent exclusivity policies, especially when they started losing developers to a little upstart nobody console calling itself the Sega Genesis. Yes, inadvertently, Atari's needling of Nintendo had set in motion a pattern that would define the games industry for generations. To quote Yoda in the second Star Wars prequel, "Begun, the console wars have." Well, to paraphrase, Yoda said, "Begun, the Clone Wars have," and Clone Wars are different to console wars, even though they use the same letters. You see, a Clone War is a conflict where the aggressors inflict terror and despair upon the populace with generation after generation of soulless, hacked-out copy-pastes of anything that shows the slightest competence, whereas a console war... Oh, bugger, I mixed up my note cards.